Hello, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Lens. I'm your host, Carl Hansen. And today we're going to be talking to two people who have been working in the industry for quite a bit of time. They have a long storied history. I have worked with one of them for quite a bit of time as a collaborator, Mark Lucas, who is a well-known television director. He and I have been producing partners for a number of years, and he has acted in a number of the 48-hour film projects that I've made and competition films I've made over the years. And then his longtime collaborator, who he worked with for a number of years, a cameraman, a producer, a director, who's worked on things from the Iditarod to the Olympics, among many other things. And that is Peter Henning. I'm going to bring them in right now. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome, welcome.
How you doing, Carl? Hey, Pete.
Well, thank you guys so much for talking to me today. This is really exciting to have both of you here. Mark, obviously you and I have known each other for a number of years. And in fact, the way that you and I had met was working at Mark Burnett Productions. I was looking for a director for Bully Beatdown, an MTV show that we were doing at the time. And Mark, you sent me your resume through a website, I think it was Reality Staff at the time, and you had directed the first 19 UFC fights. So it just seemed like a natural fit with the kind of program we were doing. So we've known each other for quite a bit of time, but you and Peter, have known each other for much longer period of time. And I'm kind of curious, how did you guys meet and how did you guys get started working together?
I worked for a production company out of Detroit, Michigan, Tom Thomas organization. And I'd started from the bottom as a gopher, $95 a week, and just brutal. And I had a horrible boss directly in front of me. He really didn't want me to advance because he knew I got the job partially because my father knew the owner of Tom Thomas. So I had that problem. But I slowly worked my way up, and we were doing a show. We were doing a corporate gig. I don't know if it was Glenwood Springs, Colorado, but somewhere Peter and I were on a location. I'd never met him before. And we immediately hit it off. We had the same style of work and style of relaxation. And I learned a lot watching him because he was much more experienced than me. And I'd only done corporate stuff and he had really done network stuff. So I was kind of in awe of him just because he knew so much about a lot of part of the business that I'd never even touched. So we met on this job. I think it was it Colorado where we met?
It was Glenwood Springs.
Yeah. And we, it was a great shoot. We had a crazy ass director, Dennis Knife, who thought he was Fellini and he was far from it. And it was great. It was like about a week-long shoot, and we became fast friends from that. And that's how I eventually got at ABC through Peter a couple of years later. That's a quick version of how I met Peter and how we've been together ever since then. That was probably 1970. So we've been friends for a while.
It would have been the early 70s. Yep.
Yeah.
And what's your impression, Peter, of that first meeting of Mark?
Well, I think that was the first time I had actually worked for Tom Thomas too. I don't know how that got into it. So you always go into a new location with new people, kind of seeing how it's going to go. Well, I think it was on the first day I met Mark, and I said, we're going to have fun on this one. And we both discussed things, and we had our same style of doing things, both in our personal lives and in business and TV. And the bottom line, we like to have a good time, but put out a good product. And that's what it's still my philosophy today. You can't put out a good product unless you're enjoying yourself. So it's, that's the way I still feel.
That's great. Yeah. So Peter, I'm actually kind of curious. You sent me a little bit of your bio, but I'm curious how you got started in this business. And I think was your father in the business as well in some respects?
My father was a combat cameraman during World War II. He was in the Pacific, actually was in China, Burma, India, up in Burma most of the time with a group called Merle's Marauders. But anyway, he covered World War II. And when I was born when he was overseas. And my mother still tells the story that he came home and knocked on the door, and I went to the house, or I went up to the front door, and I ran to my mom and said, "Hey, Mom, there's a soldier man at the front door." That was my father. But anyway, he got out of the army and then was brought back into it as a civilian advisor to the Signal Photographic Corps, and we moved to Austria. And When I turned 6, he decided, I didn't decide, he decided that I was going to become a cameraman. And for my birthday that year, he gave me a 16 millimeter Filmo camera, a 100-foot load of Plus X film, and a light meter. And he says, Peter, your assignment this week is to go out and bring me back a story of traffic. So what I had to do is on the weekend, shoot around, we were living in Vienna at the time, shoot around Vienna to tell a story of traffic. I'd bring this footage back to him on Sunday evening. In the early days, he was with me because he wouldn't let me wander around by myself. He'd take the film, have it processed in the signal cord lab, and then on Wednesday nights, we would have dailies. And you never knew 100 feet of film could last so long, because my father wasn't as much of a teacher as he was an autocrat. As you will it to do it this way. And in the end, we probably weren't the greatest friends in the world, but I learned a lot from him. He passed when I was 16 years old, but he went on to work at CBS and after we left Austria, and he did a lot of TV commercials and stuff like that. But I had made up at one point I was not going to be a cameraman, and I went to school to be a school teacher. But then that didn't fit into the program very well, so I went back to being a cameraman, and the best decision I ever made.
Wow. So interesting. So your dad was kind of in the business and really kind of pushed you in a way to get into it. And you've been doing that ever since. And Mark, your father was also in the business, right? That's how you kind of got in?
My dad was an advertising guy, Cam Leewald in Detroit, and Chevrolet and General Motors was his big clients. And he was the guy in charge of all the broadcasting. Like Peter's dad brought home a camera, my dad brought home the Nielsen ratings. And I would get them like every couple of weeks, and I'd be looking at them. And he'd say, "Well, do you notice anything?" I said, "Well, why in the third of the Dinah Shore show was it?" He goes, "That goddamn Red Skelton didn't show up." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he was like the way you're describing your dad too, Peter. He was a real autocrat, really tough. And I, of course, was an insane child, so it must have been the worst possible mix. But when I got older, then I also got this job, and I thought, I think I might like to get into that business. So I started, as I said, when I'd gone to GM Photographic, thinking I'd be doing films for General Motors because they had a huge department, and they, of course, didn't. But they said, well, maybe you'll be able to send over there. That never happened. So instead, they laid me off. And through my father, I got this job at Tom Thomas, and then I was there for 4 years. And the great thing about it, though, was after 2 years, I said, I'd rather go to the New York office. I met the guy who ran it. And also I wanted to go to New York. And I knew Peter and a bunch of people in New York. And I said, I don't want to be in Detroit. I don't want to just shoot cars the rest of my life. So I went, and they transferred me to New York, and that changed everything. I was doing a lot of more location stuff. The guy who I worked with in Detroit, who hated me and made my life miserable, he wasn't around. I worked with Peter a lot more once I got to New York too, because I could get him on jobs. So from that point on, that really changed. And he and I, at that point, then traveled all over the world. I mean, doing all sorts of stuff, all the way to India with Robert Duvall, and Peru and the Bahamas with Christopher Plummer. And we got our own shorthand. So we knew if he was going to say, we're going to do this, set this up for me, or, whatever. So we got our own little shorthand going. And it was a very efficient group of guys who did, of course, enjoy downtime. We were still very much interested in enjoying ourselves.
So that's interesting. So I'm curious, what was the relationship? Were you producing and directing, Mark?
Yeah. Okay. And sometimes I would really lean on Peter to direct something like, okay, wait a minute, we got to get Plummer. I know I'd like to have somewhere on the Inca Trail. So we all walked down to the Inca Trail, which is this little teeny path on a cliff. And he was scared to death of heights. And so we got him up there. But I relied a lot on Peter, not just as a camera guy. I mean, he'd shot everywhere and he knew everything. So he could come up with a suggestion. I wouldn't go, no, I have a better idea. I'd go, hey, actually, that's pretty good. Let's do it. So it worked that way.
Right. Well, and I was going to maybe ask about those experiences, right? You're stepping into these international locations that I'm guessing you didn't have time to scout. You didn't have time to really prep a ton, that you're suddenly on that Inca Trail. You have to figure out how to how to shoot it in the moment, right? It's like a very, very quick situation for you guys.
Yeah, and that one show that we did in Peru was with Christopher Plummer, and he's a really, one of the finest actors of our generation. So he had to know we knew what we were doing. And Peter had actually seen the play. I think you'd seen the Inca Sun or whatever.
Royal Hunt of the Sun.
Yes. And we actually had him do a little quote from it. Peter was great with that, with finding quotes that Plummer could do, because we ended up doing a show years later about the inns of Connecticut. And the two of them were working on, the exact how it would go. And Plummer doesn't take advice lightly. If you better have a good idea, or he's just going to look at you and just say, who the f are you? But he really leaned on Peter a lot, and me, but more Peter, just because Peter was approaching him as how he's going to look on camera, which is
age wise too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one of the interesting things about that shoot was it actually happened in the edit room. The editor by the name of Angelo Bernaducci cut the show at ABC, and he called me into his edit room. He said, Peter, I want you to look at this. And he played, about a minute and a half piece of dialogue that Plummer was reading from the play, the script. And I said, yeah, we did that. That was a good take. He says, well, that was the audio from take 1 played with the picture from take 3, and his lip sync was
wow. I didn't remember that.
Yeah. Cool. It was like just everything was exactly the same. So it was amazing working with him.
Yeah.
Wow. So Peter, when you guys got to a location, right? Say I'm focusing on the Inca Trail because that's the story that you guys were just talking about as well. What is your process, right? So obviously you guys are working together, you're traveling together. How are you guys planning things? And when you're in the moment, what are you doing at that point?
Well, my first plan is whenever we got to a new city was find the hotel bar and sit down and come up with a plan.
Yeah.
Because unless you had a plan of where you're going to go, you can just wander around willy-nilly. So we'd sit down with a couple of, what were those drinks? Pisco sours in Peru. And work on a pad of what we wanted to accomplish in the whole thing. And Mark and I would collaborate on that. And then we'd think about visuals. And then we go out and find the visuals. And luckily we shot in a place called Macchu Picchu, which today, like everybody and their brother's been there. But you go back into the early 70s, it was still a pretty remote place. So there weren't a lot of pictures, a lot of things. So we were finding these awe-inspiring sites that were just super to have Chris with a background.
The one thing I do to prep on, if I knew where we were going, because I'm a real history freak and a map freak, and Peter and I both love maps, but I would start looking at things and I go, okay, so there's Machu Picchu, there's Huayna Picchu, that one we can't go, it's like a brutal climb. And then Peter said, hey, wait a minute, the Inca Trail looked pretty good over there, and we go there and it works. It just seemed to fit, and there was never ego, well, I wanted to do it my way, and why didn't you do this? And it was just, okay, cool, that works. We were happy if it just worked. And
sometimes you get lucky.
Yeah.
We happened to be in Cusco, well, actually in Machu Picchu, the day of the summer solstice.
That's right.
Which was the biggest holiday in the Incan Empire. And there's a window in one of the buildings in Machu Picchu that at sunrise, it comes up at an angle that floods the whole room with this golden light from the thing. We were there on that day and clouds were gone. It was beautiful. And we were able to get all that. And not only that, they had a big called Inti a ceremony with the Atahualpa being carried in on a thing. And we were able to shoot that and edit that. Mark took care of that part, getting it into the whole story.
Wow. So it was unplanned for you to be there on that day. It just so happened you were there on the solstice.
It was probably based on ABC's budget. No, the flights are cheaper.
Yes. Yeah. And then in the other town, in Cusco, they actually had the big ceremony where they were carrying the guy around, and it was like thousands of people singing and chanting in the Quechua language. So even if you knew Spanish, you're still going, I have no clue what these people are saying. So it was pretty amazing. It came out great. It was a great film, and it was great fun to be on. Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's phenomenal. And I think for a lot of the people that watch this and this specific podcast, they're interested in how things get made, right? There's a lot of people who may not know sort of what happens behind the lens, right? Behind the camera, and all that goes into it. All they see is that beautiful piece that you've worked on for however long you've worked on it, while your real life is going on simultaneously, right? You're having these interactions, these relationships. You're probably meeting a lot of the locals, having relationships with those people, and figuring out, how you guys are working together, especially when you first started. But I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, when you first started working together, you didn't have that shorthand yet. Right. How long did it take you guys to kind of get into that rhythm and kind of figure out how to work well together? Or was it really that kind of instantaneous at the meeting?
Peter would get something going. If I didn't know exactly what was happening, or neither of us did, Peter would come up with something. And sometimes it'd be perfect, and sometimes say, oh yeah, what else we could do is this. But Peter, you can rely on. He'll say, look, okay, we'll have the two people here, we'll have this. And it just got to be our own kind of shorthand. We knew what was going to happen. I knew he would shoot it great. I knew he would think of a way that it can cut. A lot of camera guys don't care much about how it all cuts. They just say, I got you great footage of this. He would always say, wait a minute, let me go up on this hill because I want to get a wide shot. Let me do this. Let me do it. I mean, I think that's how it worked, right, Pete?
To me, you either hit it off or you don't hit it off.
Yeah.
It's like finding the perfect woman. It's you have a relationship.
It's chemistry.
And it's
trust.
Huge
thing with trust. Which would lead me to the shot when I was in a helicopter at about 14,000 feet in India, and we were doing aerials. And Peter's an amazing aerial guy. If you get him like on a bicycle in the air, somehow he gets a shot. So we're getting ready, and he's getting set, and pilot comes around. He goes, clip your belt in. And I said, yeah, I got the belt in, and he's got his in, and we go up, and we're starting to do really severe turns. I mean, we're going around, we're shooting the Himalayas. And we're flying around and leaning like almost straight down and coming around again. And I'm just sitting there, and I go, okay, well, where else are we going to go? Well, there's one other place. And all of a sudden, Peter looks down and he starts laughing. And I go, well, what's so funny? He goes, look at your belt. I go, yeah, I'm back then. He goes, no, look at the other one. It's flapping and it wasn't bolted in. You wouldn't even find my body. And so he told me, I think he had the pilot lean the other way so I could get everything back to normal, and it was all right. But
yeah, he wasn't attached to the helicopter. He was attached to the belt. That was it.
Yeah, it was. So we had a lot of scenes like that in our lives. You remember when we were in Indiana doing the truck thing for Tom Thomas, and somehow I almost fell back onto. Remember, it didn't have a chassis at all. It just had the raw, the axle and the drivetrain. And I was talking to my assistant and camera guy, Alex Fernbach, and I caught myself because I almost fell, and I realized I almost just fell right onto the running drivetrain. So there were things like that. I mean, the problem is I could tell you 50 stories. I mean, and never has Peter ever said, no, can't do that, man. We got to be safe. We got to. I'll just say one more just because this one blew me away too. We were on the Iditarod Road from Fairbanks, the Hall Road, all the way up to Prudhoe Bay. And I said, I'd love to get a shot, but these won't stop for me. They won't let me do a passing by shot. And he goes, hang on, Marco. So I see the window coming down, and he goes, I'm going to get in the back. And I said, well, I could stop. And he goes, no, those aren't going to wait for us. He said, just hand me the camera in a minute. So I'm driving with 3 55-gallon drums of jet fuel in the back so we can fill the helicopter. He's crawling out there. It's 30 below. He's turning purple as I'm watching. He takes the camera. He gets the shots. We finally get him back in the thing, and I'm going, a lot of guys wouldn't have done this shot. And it looked great.
So that's really fascinating. And Peter, I'm curious because also another story that I've heard, and in fact, my first introduction to you, I think, was a story Mark told me of when you were dangling out of the helicopter during the Olympics for like skiing runs. Is that correct?
No, it wasn't the Olympics. It was it was the year after the Innsbruck Olympics, and it was in Laos, Switzerland for the World Cup downhill. I had seen a couple of years before a camera rig that an English cameraman had used when he was the second unit cameraman on one of the first, either the second or the third James Bond film. And he had designed this rig where it's a parachute harness that you sit in and you attach it to the skids of the helicopter, and you're essentially 25 feet below the helicopter. And
just dangling by this
dangling
parachute.
Underneath. Yeah. But he used it, and it was a great reason because it was the Bond film that had the gyrocopters shooting at each other. So they were able to come in around him and do. And I thought, this is amazing. You know, you can shoot forward, you can move. It's your freedom is there to get these shots. Ever since I saw how they did that, I wanted to try it. And the first time I tried it, it was up in Alaska. In 1975, I did a special on John Denver special in Alaska called Alaska America's Child. And we used it up there to get scenics in the Wrangell Mountains and going down between the glaciers and all that stuff. And then we went to Laos, Switzerland for the World Cup after Innsbruck. It took 6 or 7 times to do because the one thing sounds really neat, but when the helicopter following the skier and the skier makes a hard left turn, the helicopter makes it, well, you swing out behind the helicopter alongside so you get almost perpendicular to the ground, and then by the time you stabilize again you get another shot. So we did that chasing a skier by the name of Franz Klammerer down the hill. He was a gold medalist that previous year. We used it one time on American Sportsman. We were fly fishing with William Conrad in Idaho. I actually knew the helicopter pilot here and asked him if he wanted to do it. And he said, sure. So I devised this shot where we had Kurt Gowdy and Bill Conrad fly fishing, casting off of a bank, which was about 5 feet in the air. And we started with the helicopter out about a quarter of a mile and then came down onto them between 2 trees and across the river and just above it. So I was almost looking up at them. And then we went by them and that was the shot. Well, on the first rehearsal, we didn't notice that there was a stump in the river. And we came down and my knee hit the stump. So we looked at the shot later. It was hilarious. You come down, the shot's going perfect, and then I hit the stump, and you see the camera go boom, 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 like that. And we had to go land because I was never going to stabilize again. So we ended up getting the shot. But it was fun stuff. We didn't have things like West cams and helicopters or drones that pointed forward. You could do all this stuff. And this technology today, if I was a cameraman today, I wouldn't have had as much fun as I did when I was a cameraman.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I take it you are not afraid of heights. That's what I'm guessing from.
Oh no! I'm afraid of heights like everybody else. It's just living with it and getting a visceral feel from it.
So did you find it easier because you were shooting to do that kind of stuff? Like, was there a psychological piece to that?
Absolutely. You know, I've done a lot of animal work on that John Denver show, Polar Bear, and I was shooting a sow, a female with 2 cubs, and she saw us, and I had a hunting guide next to me, and you can hear on the original tapes and say, everybody's steady, everybody's steady. Well, the great thing about shooting with a zoom lens is you can back them up. So as they're coming closer and you're looking at it, and at one point this polar bear's head filled the frame in the wide position.
Wow.
And it finally scared him off. And they scared him off by hitting him with a Coke can. But it was that's
where the Coca-Cola integration came from. That interaction.
We actually took a shot of the Coke can. This bear had eaten a seal. So we did a little picture with a Coke can with a bloody seal carcass on it, just to say, it's at the end of the day, it's great to have a Coke.
That's incredible. And I want to bring up, Peter, you had written something to me. You said, I once read, if you want to be successful, go somewhere and do things no one wants to do. Would you consider, I feel like people would want to do that, but they don't want to be in front of a bear or dangling from a helicopter. Is that sort of what your mentality was at that time?
Neville Shute, the author who wrote oh God, famous book. Anyway, he wrote another book called Round the Bend. And in it, he describes a character, says, if you want to make it in your world, you go somewhere and do something that no one else wants to do.
Right.
And at a time in the New York area, now there were people around the country, a lot of wildlife guys, a lot of adventure mountain climbing guys who specifically did their things. And I wanted to do all of those. I always tried to get, or when I could make proposals to ABC or with Mark or whatever like that, we'd always design something that we'd go someplace and do a show that nobody, when somebody looks at it, you want them to say, wow, how did they do that? Yeah.
Right.
And that's basically, but as I was saying, in the New York area, there was like one other guy, Darcy Marsh, good friend of mine, cameraman out of Boston, and we're kind of the same age. He was an Olympic skier. He does and we worked together for years on American Sportsman and whitewater rafting trips in Russia and stuff like that. But there weren't a lot of people, nor was the equipment easy to work with. It's a lot easier putting a $1,100 cell phone in danger than a $30,000 film camera.
Right. And that technology
was also all on 16 millimeter. So we had to have cases and cases of 16 millimeter. And like when we were in India, it was just like, okay, let's hope it doesn't get to over 100 degrees again today, because that's not going to be good for anything.
And then having to go get it processed and all the things that go along with actual film, right? So not only did you have to protect before you shot it, right, so it didn't get exposed, but then everything that happens after too, especially being all over the world. I find that fascinating. Would you travel with the film back to New York? Is that how it would then get on TV essentially?
Well, the interesting story of that is Wide World of Sports. In the days that I was in the early days, we shot most of the ski races internationally, and even a lot of the Olympics were done on film.
Yeah.
So we would, for instance, let's just take the Franz Klammer thing. We did that race. The race took place on Saturday and Sunday. We would pack the film up, the assistants unload all the gear, give it to the production assistant who went to the nearest airport and got the first flight out back to New York, where he was met by the best person in the world at ABC, Charlie Stagg, who got everybody through customs. But he would then take it to the lab. The lab would process it. They would deliver it usually Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. Editors would start editing. They would do voiceover on Friday, and it would air on Saturday. And that's with a 19 camera shoot.
19 cameras?
They did the Indianapolis 500 that way.
Yeah, I shot that a number of times on film.
And then when I called you about the Formula One, I wanted to talk to somebody who'd done that, because they would, and although by then there was the Concorde.
Mm-hmm.
So they were thrilled. Once that happened, ABC Sports said, "Oh, we can do anything now. We got the Concorde. We'd be there in 3 hours."
But one of the great scenes from one of the ski races, we had a new production assistant who was usually the son of some wealthy sponsor. First, I don't know how they got that job, but that they did.
Yeah.
And he was told, the producer said, "You get this film the safest way you can to New York as fast as you can." The guy leaves. We get back on Monday or Tuesday, and the film's still not out of the lab. Look at it. He said, "Well, it should be out. It should be out. It's not here yet." He said, "What do you mean? How did you ship it?" Well, in those days, and maybe still today, I don't know, every 707 had a radioactive hold in it where they shipped radioactive isotopes and things like that. So he figured that was the safest place to put the film, was in with radioactive material.
Oh,
what?
My God.
Never heard of such a thing. I had no idea that was even a thing.
Wow.
Well, and the good news is none of the isotopes were leaking. So we got the film. It just took a long time. We're delayed. Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, it's really remarkable. And you were talking kind of about that technology piece too, Peter, sort of how, technology today probably wouldn't have allowed you to do the same kind of job that you did before. What kind of technological changes have you guys kind of seen? Obviously, you've seen that transition to digital, and then how did it change your job? Mark, I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Well, I just remember instead of having those pneumatic machines that were constantly being used, it became much more simpler and much more, easy to operate. I mean, because I was always usually spending time in the editing room watching what happened, what worked and what didn't work. I mean, Peter was too. Peter was always there, but at that point, I actually had a job at ABC, so I'd see other people's shows. Although my boss at ABC was not a big fan of me, so often my shows got less airtime than other people. When we came back from India, I said, "There's going to be a 1-hour show," and I think they ended up cutting it in like about 34 minutes. Whereas guys like Bob Duncan would do their thing, and they'd say, "Well, this is very important. We have to show this. We get the time," because he'd been there for like 15, 20 years or something.
Man, it's
the other thing with the technical stuff, we shot everything in film. I mean, ABC Sports, we did the Howard Cosell magazine show, we shot on film. All the special pieces, I did the opening to Monday Night Football on 35 millimeter film. And everybody loved the look of film. Later on, I did a lot of 60 minutes too, which was mostly film, and then they switched all to tape, except one producer, George Cryle, who's dead now, but great producer. Anyway, but the funny thing is, you get all this stuff, and you have all these new video cameras that half of us didn't know how to work. And the producer would come up to us and said, "Let's make it look like film."
Yeah.
I said, "Okay, let's shoot it on film then."
Yeah.
But anyway, I can't remember years with early days of just after what's going to video is taking black women's pantyhose and putting them behind the lens and trying to get that film look, because the video look to them as it was too sharp.
Well, and what's really interesting, and Mark and I just worked on a 48-hour film project over the weekend, where you literally have 48 hours to create, write, shoot, edit, and make a finished short film that digitally, like we shoot on digital cameras now, but they look like film, and we're able to actually turn this around in that amount of time. But you guys are telling me, even with actual film, you were turning stuff around very, very quickly. That stuff that was getting shot then was getting turned around so quickly to get on the air. Like, I find that fascinating with the actual technology you had at that time.
Well, actually, there were two types of film. There was negative and reversal.
Reversal, right.
And we would always use the reversal because you didn't have to take the time to make a print from it. So we could just go right with the film. So that saved time there. So
interesting. Yeah, that's really, really cool. I'm also curious, and Peter, you had sent me a bunch of your stories, and Mark, I know a bunch of your stories, but in Charlie Wilson in Afghanistan, I think was one of your stories, Peter, right? Did you guys work on that together?
No, I didn't work on it.
So, but that was something that then became a movie, right? I mean, like, you were working on things, and I'm sure you guys both have sort of these stories that were sort of seeds that then kind of grew into something maybe much bigger than potentially what you thought at the time, or you were a part of almost history, right? Doing certain things like the 747, right? The introduction of the 747, were you there for that one, Mark? I'm not sure the stories that you guys worked on together, but what kind of stories do you have in terms of like, oh, I was there when X happened, and then years later it sort of has become sort of a much more epic story than maybe just being there in the moment?
Charlie Wilson, the producer, that was a guy named George Cryle, who ended up writing the book Charlie Wilson's War. And Charlie, if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it, because everything even the movie that was made from it is factual. You can't believe the way this man was, and his traveling with his personal belly dancer and all kinds of things like that. We had just crossed over from Pakistan into Afghanistan with these trucks and stuff with the Mujahideen. All of a sudden, out of a tent, riding a white horse, looking like Lawrence of Arabia, came Charlie Wilson. And I looked at George and I said, "George, you can either make this guy a hero or one of the biggest bumbling idiots you ever wanted to be." And that line is actually in the book.
Wow, that's That's incredible. And Mark, you were there for the very first 19 Ultimate Fighting Championships when it was truly like no holds barred, right? I mean, that was something I think.
No, there was no rules. There was absolutely no rules. I don't think that holds up historically compared to like Afghanistan. Yeah, it was accurate and it was real. And the company, I was really lucky. It was a company they'd only done music, and I'd been trying to get in there to do concerts because I wanted to do more music. And the guy out of the blue said, "Hey, we're doing the show Ultimate Fighting," and I thought to myself, "That's the stupidest thing I ever heard in my life. There's no rules. There's gonna be death. It's just stupid." But it worked out really well. And they didn't know anything about sports in terms of live sports, how to put cameras and things. So they just let me, I had free reign, except for a couple things. They didn't understand why I'd have a RoboCam directly over the mat. And I said, well, the guy's going to be on his back occasionally, right? Somebody's going to be. And they said, yeah. And I said, I'm going to be able to look right into his eyeballs. And the owner said, you're never going to use that shot. I said, I'll bet you if I don't shoot it at least 40 times in the 2-hour show, I will give you all the rental that costs for that camera. He said, you're on. And so naturally, I used it about 100 times because it was just a great shot. And now it's used all the time on that kind of stuff. But yeah, that was groundbreaking, certainly. I mean, it was a good gig for those shows. I was glad to get off of it because it was where you're going to go.
Right. Well, and I mean, kind of setting the look too, right? It's sort of like being there at the outset, being able to set the look, and then people becoming accustomed to that look. And I remember we were in Salt Lake City the first time we essentially worked together on Bully Beatdown because we were filming there. And we went to a bar and there was a UFC fight going on that night. And you were pointing out very specific things that you had done. And it was really your idea right at the start that were now part of the way that story gets told.
Oh, yeah. It's still told very much with that same thing, the same camera positions. I mean, they have better cameras and nicer cameras and they have much better lighting. But the cutting of it is, it's a show. It's a live show.
So what other stories in they can be the family friendly ones if you have those to kind of share that sort of are your kind of go-to stories that when you guys reminisce and I know you guys still have conversations today where it's like, oh, do you remember that time? Are there any ones that kind of really resonate that bring you back to that time?
The funny thing is that I'm sitting here thinking some of these stories, and that was really stupid.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of stupid.
You have to remember we were a lot younger. I guess the one that for me that my family talks about is the introduction of the 747. I was doing all the PR work for Pan Am, and when they got their first 747 delivered in the Bahamas, so they didn't have to spend Seattle sales tax. That's why they went there. But the people in the Bahamas heard that this plane was coming, and they were lined up, crowds of people, and to the point where they wanted to get on the airplane. So they decided, the Pan Am people, that they'd put a gangplank or what do you call those things up front and one in the back, and they'd let these people onto the airplane and they'd walk to the end and come off. And honest to God, for 2 hours, farmers, goats, chickens, hookers, everything were walking on these airplanes to look at it and see it and going, just stealing blankets, pillows, and everything else that were on there. They were getting gathered at the end. They finally got the plane sealed off, and we flew back to New York. And we get to the Pan Am hangar where Najib Halabi, who was the CEO of Pan Am at the time, was there with all his board of directors and everything else to take a look at the airplane. And they all have little booties on their Oxford shoes so they don't get any tramp any dirt in the airplane.
Wow. And that was the first time the 747 had been seen. That was why it was sort of like
outside of Seattle. But I spent the next 2 months traveling on the 744. They would give demonstration rides to travel agents and tour companies. And we'd go to, say, Houston. Well, Miami's one for sure. And they'd park the airplane and people would get on and they'd look at the airplane. And then they would take half the people and they'd do a flight with them with a flight attendant, serve drinks and complimentary drinks and stuff, and then they'd come back and land, and then the next group would go. And we did this, I think, 10 times in the 48 states. Then we did it once to London, and then we did it to Honolulu and Tokyo. And the flight crew consisted of 2 very senior Pan Am captains, 2 very senior Pan Am first officers who were captains, 2 very senior flight engineers, an engineer from Pratt & Whitney, an engineer from Bell and Howell because they had the motion picture deal going, and a senior FAA observer, and myself, and 36 flight attendants. And
36.
Yeah, and that was the people in the crew.
That's incredible. And you traveled the world with that plane, is that correct?
Well, almost, yeah.
Wow. That's incredible.
Actually, London, we had to come back hurried because Mrs. Nixon christened it. So we had to get the plane back according to her schedule so she could christen it in Washington.
Naturally.
I mean, you guys have traveled all over the world. And, I think something about the quote that you mentioned, do things that no one else wants to do, Peter, it really is almost access more than anything that we get in this business that we wouldn't necessarily get otherwise.
Correct.
Right? That sort of you get to go behind the ropes, right? You kind of you get really exceptional access. Like you were talking about Macchu Picchu before many people went there. I mean, that to me is an incredible experience that not many people probably have in their lifetime. And you guys are chock full of those kinds of stories. It becomes a dream job, right? Like there were things that I've been able to do in my career that I never thought I'd be able to do just being a kid from Massachusetts without any ties to this business at all. I didn't have family in the business, although I will say that my grandfather did develop the second strongest light next to the laser that was used in motion picture copying, right? When they were actually printing prints of films. My grandfather invented that kind of light bulb. I think it was like for Sylvania. I forget who he was working for at the time. But so while that was sort of in my family history, it's not like, oh yeah, here's your entry point into the industry, Carl. Like I had to find my own way in. I didn't have that kind of family connection, but truly feeling incredibly grateful for the kinds of experiences that I have been able to have because I work in this business that I don't know that I would have ever been able to do if I didn't. Right? Like traveling the world and seeing places I wouldn't. Are there things that you guys still haven't done at the stages where you are in your life and career that you still would like to do? Is there sort of like a bucket list that you guys are still maybe looking for that you haven't experienced yet?
I think the times of experiencing that type of thing is probably gone. It's a different world we're living in now. It's sad, but I'm almost to the point where I don't want to go anywhere anymore. I mean, one of the reasons I think this could speak for Mark and myself, both, we would sit around and we were lucky enough to work for a company, as weird as it was at times. But if we came up with an idea, we wanted to go to some ridiculous place in the world, they'd give us the license to do it.
Yeah.
And you don't find that in the business today.
Yeah.
We hit the business, I think, at the ultimate time for what we did. I don't think what we had done in the past could be done today. It's just it's a different mindset. I mean, how many white villages, or what do you call white cities, that you chase of that? Sooner or later somebody will say that there isn't any Ciudad Blanca. Mark, forget about it. But Marco was like an explorer, going like Columbus, going to Queen Isabella to say, hey, except it was, hey, John, I need money. I'm going to go find Ciudad Blanca now.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So
the map was written on a dining room table that we'd gotten in Tegucigalpa because the guy said, no, the maps you're going to look at are bullshit. This is what you got to use. So there's a picture of me getting on this DC-3 in this horrible runway. and I've got a big tablecloth tucked under there. And you can see there's drawings on it. I mean, it's nuts. But yeah, it's true. A lot of the things like that are not going to happen again. But I think they'll find their own stuff they're doing. I mean, they'll just be doing more incredible things that probably. And there's also, I like the hands-on type thing. I loved when I first saw an assistant cameraman working in a black bag, changing a mag. I thought, this is like a guy splitting the atom. How can this guy do this? So little things like that, or Peter would show me some super long lens thing, and I go, this is like amazing. We're right on the cutting edge of everything. And now, of course, it's looked at like, we're going to put that in the Smithsonian, dude. It's not really necessary anymore. But we did see a lot of great things over the period of our careers. Definitely.
One final black bag story. There was an assistant cameraman by the name of George Berrios in New York. And I forget who he was. I was working with a guy named Dick Roy, cameraman. And they were shooting at Madison Square Garden at a hockey match. And he was down on the bench where the hockey players sit and all that stuff. And he had to change a magazine, and he's in the black bag. And lo and behold, the puck came flying in the thing and hit him in the head. So A, knocked him out. B, you know what a scalp wound bleeds like.
Bleeding.
Gushing blood all over the place. And then the director is saying, don't take his hands out of the bag. Don't take his hands out. They carried George out on a stretcher holding the black bag.
Oh, my God.
He got in the ambulance, and he ended up gaining consciousness again, and he unloaded the magazine.
Wow.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't happen today.
That is typical. I find now there's always safety guys. There's an ambulance or something like this. We were going to places with nothing.
Yeah.
It was just like the first UFC, there was nothing there. There was one old ambulance, and turned out the guy wasn't really an ambulance driver. He just had a friend, but things were just done that way. No, it'll work out. Don't worry about it.
This all sounds like fun and games. And yes, it was fun and games, and we had great time. But I try to describe it to people, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, because all sporting events either take place on weekends, holidays, at night, some of them all. You are basically never home.
Yeah.
If you're covering baseball, it's strenuous on relationships, on your marriage, with your kids. That way, I think part of the reason Mark and I were able to survive it a little because of our attitude, and it's probably why we have ex-wives too. But it's not all for the fun and games. There's a lot of tears and anguish in it at times too, especially with kids. And
most of my life was no overtime. It was just, you're working. I thought I'd be done in 5 hours. And they go, okay, well, you're the director producer. You got it done. Great. Yeah, but it was 22 hours. Have a great life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But really the impact that it takes on your personal life, right? It's sort of like that double-edged sword. I love the best of times, worst of times reference, because I have definitely felt that too, right? It definitely impacts your relationship. But I know for me personally, like, I love production, right? I really love making things. And that access, again, is really incredible when you have it. But really, what is the trade-off there? And how do you then live your life and have a family and have, you know what I mean? It's sort of that balancing act that I think we all still struggle with today, of how to achieve that while still also making a career for yourself. And, you know, I think especially where we are now as a world and as a country, after really the depths of COVID, when everybody was just stuck at home for a while, almost created a reckoning among people of, what do we want to do? How do we make that work-life balance work? More so now, I think, than ever before. At least I know I feel that way during this.
It's also that we were like the Mad Men generation.
Yeah.
I mean, people drank, people smoked, people crashed cars. It was like, no big deal. It's just like, we're going to get it done. Don't worry about it. Everything. Okay. I mean, the whole attitude was not saying, okay, now we got to make sure everybody's gotten tested. Everybody's got, it's like, you got shots, right? Okay, let's go. That was the test. That was to prove that you were ready to roll. They were more concerned with the gear than the people. It's like, how many mags you got? 12. Okay, well, you got this guy, this guy. Everybody got their ticket. No, it was like, yeah, okay, well, he'll be there. If he isn't there, the plane's taken without him. So it was very much like a Mad Men type thing. And my dad was in advertising, so it hits me hard. But when Peter was talking about marriages and kids, yeah, it's hard to juggle all that.
Yeah, that's really incredible. And you guys have had such an amazing, all those amazing stories, a real storied career for both of you guys, both individually and together, right? The stories you were relating together. But I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for your time coming here and talking to me about your experiences and what it's actually like. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Anything maybe we didn't cover that you wanted to, or any sort of last pearls or words of wisdom at all, or even something you want to say to each other before we close it down? Yeah. And it's okay if not, because I know you guys still talk frequently. So
I think what I tell people about my job, I didn't have an adult job. I had a kid's job. And I think that's what's kept me at least mentally young, I think, and physically up there, is because of the experiences I've had and the attitude and working with people like Mark and other guys, Alan Schneider, even John Wilcox, guys you meet, the Tony Onis of the world and things like that. It just gives you a whole different outlook than someone who gets on the 917 in Poughkeepsie and goes to New York City. It's a whole different outlook on life.
But you know what's interesting about that? I was doing a show at some stockbroker, E.F. Hutton, and we were on a lunch break. And it was funny. Most of the crew would come up to me and go, "Can you imagine being dressed with these coats and ties? And these guys are such they're so arrogant." And we all had that attitude, like our life is great, but these poor bastards. Mm-hmm. So everybody broke for lunch, and I had a little work to do. So I was at a desk, and I heard two guys. I didn't even look up at them, but they were there. The guy goes, "Those guys done?" And he goes, "No, they'll be back." And he goes, "What a group of." He goes, "Yeah, I mean, just they're all wearing blue jeans, and they're all like, yeah, are they sure they can shoot this?" And I realized, it's funny. It's who. What's your point of view? If you're an E.F. Hutton guy, you think, God, those guys, that's a miserable life. I mean, look at them with blue jeans, and they're like, we got the life to live. And I just said, wow. And I remember also I'd done Ultimate Fighting, and they said, okay, you're going to do now the vice chairman or something. And I said, okay, he has to talk to you first. So I go over, and he's in makeup, and he goes, what have you done that I've seen? So I'm naming everything, okay, I did Olympic. He goes, I don't know them that. I don't know that well. You did nothing that I care about? And I said, I do the UFC. He goes, holy. He goes, really? He waves over two guys, the head of international stocks trading, the guy in the metals market. And they're asking me, well, how come when Hoist tagged out, he didn't just, I go, dude, I don't train them. I shoot the show. Yeah, but wouldn't you be able to talk to them? I said, I'm going to tell Hoist Gracie how to do an arm bar to somebody. But it's funny, the people's attitudes.
Yeah. Well, guys, this has been a real pleasure and joy talking to you about your stories. I want to thank you again for joining me. I'm gonna take the show out now and thank our viewers also for watching. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Behind the Lens, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.